Bring National Post beyond the headlines. Shop official merch including hoodies, hats, mugs, tote bags, and more, designed for readers who like their journalism bold. Visit postmedia.store today. The future of Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre has been a subject of open debate since last year's federal election. Despite a polling lead heading into last year's vote, the Conservatives fell to a rejuvenated Liberal Party under Mark Carney. But could Poilievre be primed for a political comeback? I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post political reporter Simon Tuck joins me to discuss what factors could play into a Conservative resurgence and whether there are other political comeback stories that align with where Poilievre finds himself now. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Simon, there's been a lot of talk in the last 12 months or so, and quite rightly, I suppose, given he is the Prime Minister, on Mark Carney, how he's doing as PM, what his response has been to relations with the US, the work being done to get provinces like Alberta back into the fold. But how would you describe the last year for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre?
Well, it's certainly been an interesting year for Mr. Poilievre for a number of reasons. First of all, he had to deal with what must have been a stinging loss for him to be more than 20 points ahead in the opinion polls just a few months before the election in April. And then to not just lose the election to a new Liberal leader who came out almost from nowhere, but to lose his own seat in the Ottawa area, and then be faced with to ultimately achieve his goal of becoming prime minister and to get his party in power, looking at a very difficult three-step process to achieve that goal. First of all, being to get back in Parliament, which was probably the easiest of the three obstacles. As you know, one of his MPs in Alberta stepped down, a very conservative-friendly riding, so he was able to accomplish that. And then, secondly, because the party had lost, to have to deal with an automatic review of his leadership, and he got over that hurdle quite impressively with, if I remember right, 86% of party faithful voting in his favor. And then the third part, of course, is the most difficult, winning a general election, which a few months ago looked like it could happen within months or a year, maybe 2 years. And now, with the Liberals winning a couple of by-elections and being the benefactors of 5 crossovers, 4 from the Conservatives, 1 from the NDP, it looks like it's highly unlikely there'll be an election anytime within 3 years or so. So I suppose you could say that's good or bad for Mr. Poilievre. It means that the Liberals are more entrenched as the government and will have a longer period to carry out their agenda and to show Canadians that they're worthy of another win, perhaps. From a more positive view for Mr. Poilievre, it means he has more time to rebuild and mount a bit of a political comeback.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, since losing last spring, he had to win a by-election in Alberta. He had to survive a leadership review. But, you know, if you look at some of the polling that's out there and has been out there for a couple months, he doesn't appear to have recovered with the wider public. And I'm curious, how much of that do analysts feel is due to Mark Carney not being Justin Trudeau? And how much of that has to do with Pierre Poilievre himself?
Well, I would say, Dave, that the Poilievre's brand hasn't changed a whole lot. He is who he is, for better or for worse. You know, if you like what he's offering, then you like his authenticity. If he's not your cup of tea, then you don't. Carney's come into the picture and very much established himself as someone that many Canadians seem to trust. And we're obviously dealing with a difficult time, notably with Canada-U.S. relations, but just broadly in the world, it's a fairly turbulent period. And Carney seems to be, for many people, a steady hand at the wheel. So that's a challenge for Poilievre. And the fact that he is the opposition leader, not the prime minister, means that probably people aren't thinking about him as much as they are the government. Uh, uh, and so he has a challenge in trying to convince people that he's worthy of being the next prime minister.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with that in mind, is it more likely that because he's just the opposition leader and people are focused on the prime minister, that it's more likely that Carney's performance will be the biggest factor in determining Poilievre's success? Or are there things that people feel he can do now to turn around his party's fortunes?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, first of all, history would suggest that opposition parties become governments, usually when governments are seen to be failing. Uh, Now, that's not to say that opposition parties can't present themselves as competent and worthy of being the next government, but their success largely is a function of the government's success or failure. So I'm sure conservative advisors are telling Poilievre, compared to maybe what they were saying 18 to 24 months ago, that maybe the strategy is to lay low a bit, not to stay out of the public limelight, but to not be as aggressive in in uh, in responses, both in Parliament and when dealing at public events.
Mm-hmm. In your piece, you talk about a number of historical political comebacks, from John A. Macdonald to Winston
Mm-hmm.
Churchill, Richard Nixon. And I'm curious if there are lessons conservatives in Canada can potentially learn from any of these, and perhaps which examples are perhaps the most instructive to apply to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party in Canada.
Yes, I think there are. Now, having said that, the first thing we should say when we're talking about historical comebacks, and in my article, I went all the way back to Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So, the first thing to understand is that every situation is different. So, a comeback is largely a function of the circumstances that exist at that time. But there are things we can learn. So, one of them is, first of all, most political comeback attempts fail, despite the fact that the ones that succeed often become very famous, whether it's uh, Caesar, as I mentioned, or Richard Nixon, or De Gaulle, or Churchill, any of the guys. Uh, Another thing I would add, as I was saying, the circumstances in a particular situation have absolutely everything to do with it. Uh, Analysts did point out, however, that one of the characteristics that's common in a political comeback is that the person trying to make that comeback often has a period in exile. And Napoleon being a famous example, again mentioning Richard Nixon, who who famously said to reporters in 1962, after losing the gubernatorial race in California, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," implying, his public life is over. Of course, it wasn't. He came back. He spent the next 6 years trying to make a comeback, and was very successful in doing so. Another characteristic is that, for the most part, when you come back, or you attempt to make a comeback, you need to tell voters uh, there's a reason why you've changed, or why what you were saying all along now applies differently to the changed circumstances, so that you have something new to offer. You rejected me before, but now it's different. In terms of uh, if there's any particular case that the Conservatives and Mr. Poilievre can learn from, I would argue that it's Richard Nixon. And the reason I would say that is, and whenever we talk about Richard Nixon, the first thing, in terms of the 60s anyway, the first thing I need to mention is he's most famous, of course, for Watergate and that scandal, arguably the most famous scandal over perhaps the last
Mm-hmm.
century. We're not talking about Watergate, and we're talking about Nixon in the 60s, when he went from being a a McCarthyite crusader in the 50s, and then the vice president for Eisenhower, and then attempted to become president, lost to JFK in a very close race in 1960, as I mentioned, then lost to gubernatorial race in 1962, and then plotted his comeback that was successful in 1968. So the things that they have in common, I would say, include the fact that Poilievre and Nixon, both clearly political animals with a passion for the job and succeeding, and that is important. Donald Savoy, one of the people I quoted in the article, made the point that you have to have the passion to have any chance at a political comeback after a very difficult defeat. Both Nixon and Poilievre also had established reputations for being on the 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 right wing, both within their parties and within their countries, and then felt some pressure after their stinging losses to moderate a little bit and to change their image somewhat, to come across as kinder and gentler uh, after their big losses. And both faced the good and bad characteristic of being very popular within their party bases, but perhaps less so within the broader electorate. So, I would say it's not too difficult to see a world where Mr. Poilievre benefits, as Nixon did, and this is the part where I really see some overlap from the passage of time, in that if the Canadian economy doesn't do well over the next few years, and we all know there are significant challenges, if there's no free trade deal with the US, and all of Carney's efforts to diversify trade and rebuild the Canadian economy don't produce the results that they want, perhaps affordability slash inflation remains a major issue. Uh, Despite the positive poll results that we see today, the floor crossers, etc., everything seems to be going Carney's way.
We'll be right back. In your piece, you talk about a number of historical political comebacks from MacDonald to Churchill to Nixon and what lessons conservatives in Canada can potentially learn. Which examples are perhaps the most instructive in Poilievre's case?
Well, conservative might not like to hear this, Dave, but I really think the one with the most overlap is Richard Nixon. And the reason I say that, first of all, people might not want to hear that, at least if you're a conservative partisan, is that Nixon is so associated in most people's minds with Watergate, a scandal from the early 70s that is arguably the most famous scandal, certainly in U.S. history, and maybe the most famous in this country as well, because it led to the resignation of a U.S. president. But that's not why I'm making the case. It's about Nixon in the 60s, but particularly between 1962, when he loses the gubernatorial race in California and infamously says you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. And then he immediately starts to plot his comeback, which ultimately is successful 6 years later when he becomes president in 1968. And incidentally, as some of a certain vintage will remember, won overwhelmingly again in 1972 after 4 years that were seen for the most part as pretty successful. But why there's overlap with Poilievre, in my view, is the following. First of all, they both have the drive and the ambition and the love of politics to want to make a big political comeback. They're both political animals with real passion for the job. Secondly, they had both established their reputations for being on the right wing, both of their parties and within their country's political spectrums. And then, after suffering terrible losses, in Poilievre's case last April, in Nixon's case both in 1960 and 1962, and they felt a need to represent themselves in a slightly more moderate view and kinder and gentler, if you will. The other thing that they have in common is that both were very popular within their party bases, certainly more popular than they were with the broader electorate. And so that's both a challenge and an attribute. And I would say it's not difficult to see a world where Mr. Poilievre benefits from the passage of time, as Nixon clearly did between 62 and 68. For example, if the Canadian economy doesn't do well, and we all know that there are severe challenges, number of fronts, particularly the lack of a full a full free trade deal with the U.S., not to mention fiscal challenges, etc. And if Mr. Carney's efforts to deal with those challenges, particularly to diversify trade, rebuild the Canadian economy so our infrastructure is stronger and more efficient, if these things don't produce results over the next couple of years, and inflation remains an issue, it's not too much of a stretch to think that Mr. Carney's poll numbers will fall, and perhaps he loses the next election, and Mr. Poilievre, therefore, being the person who would benefit the most. And that scenario is quite a bit like what we saw with Nixon in between 62 and 68. So in Nixon's case, the world had changed largely because of social unrest, violence, race riots, the hippie movement, widespread calls for social change, and he was able to present himself as a more calming influence, a conservative voice who would try to slow down the pace of change. Well, that wouldn't exactly be Poilievre's recipe because the situations are so different. He certainly could benefit from a changing landscape, and he certainly could present himself as someone who has the solutions for the problems that are just too persistent for the current government. Mm-hmm. So, as Laurie Turnbull said to me, a professor from Dalhousie said to me, and was quoted in the article saying, it's hard to make a comeback if you haven't left. And that's one of the differences in these two situations, in that Nixon arguably benefited from the fact that he was mostly out of the public limelight between 62 and 68. And in Poilievre's case, it doesn't look like that's the path that he will choose.
Yeah. I can imagine it'd be hard to give up your position as leader of the official opposition, especially when you're dealing with factors like this that could see the government's fortunes change on a dime, depending what happens with Kuzma, depending what happens with interprovincial issues. Does that give Poilievre an advantage, just being there as someone who may be a government in waiting? You know, the Liberals were able to change their fortunes once by changing leader, but I can't necessarily see it being possible that, you know, if things go bad for Carney, that they find someone else to step in who meets the moment in the same way. So does this give Poilievre an advantage that he's the guy who's there?
It could. That's a Weasley answer, but it's one of those things. We'll look back in hindsight, and if the Conservatives win the next election and Poilievre becomes the prime minister, we'll say that the answer to that question is yes. And if the Liberals are able to win a fifth consecutive government, then we'll say it was an advantage. And maybe, as some of those historically who have pulled off successful political comebacks have done, they stepped away in exile of some sort. I mentioned the Nixon example, but there are many others. People might argue he should have stepped away. No, it's easy to say, especially if you lose again. But it's a risky trick to try to pull off, because someone might come in and be perceived to be a very popular alternative to the government. Mm-hmm. As a new conservative leader. So it's a risky move, and I don't think Poilievre, there's no indication anyway that he intends to do that. So time will tell.
One of the interesting pieces to all of this is the dynamic of the last year. And we've talked a little bit about relations with the United States, but I think looking back on the election campaign of last year, there was not only the Carney is not Justin Trudeau piece of it, which I think helped the Liberals win another election, but I also feel that there was a perception outside of the conservative base that perhaps Pierre Poilievre wasn't the man for the moment in dealing with Donald Trump. He didn't have the international experience and perhaps was maybe a little too sympathetic to some of the leanings of conservative politics in the United States to address Canadian nationalism in a way that many Canadians would have felt appropriate. This year, we're seeing a bit of a different debate in which Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney are making the case for a united Canada and arguing the benefits of Canada. And I'm curious, does the debate around Alberta separatism pose an opportunity for Pierre Poilievre to wave the maple leaf in a way he didn't perhaps get to during the tariff debate last spring? And could that help him with more middle-of-the-road voters?
I think it does, Dave. I would agree with you. It presents that opportunity for him, but it also presents an opportunity for every federal politician to do so, including Mark Carney. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, like with the challenge last year during the election campaign, in responding to Trump's threats both to the Canadian economy and to our sovereignty, that presented a more difficult dilemma for Poilievre than it did for Carney, because certainly a greater percentage of his supporters were at least somewhat empathetic to Trump's, not just his style of politics, but some of the grievances that he was raising. And I think there's overlap there with the Alberta separatist movement, in that many of the people either behind that movement or who are just sympathetic to it are more likely to be conservative voters than they are Liberal or NDP. So maybe not as easy an issue to respond to for Poilievre than it is for Carney.
And lastly, I mean, you look at the conservative landscape in Canada, and you have a situation where it feels like there isn't really someone waiting in the wings to come in and take his place. You know, I think back to the Chrétien Martin situation, where there was someone who was kind of jockeying for position in the party, and you don't necessarily see that with the Conservatives. There's not an MP who's kind of, you know, there are people who Canadians may see as a possible successor to Pierre Poilievre, but it doesn't appear there's anyone waiting in the wings to jump in, because Pierre Poilievre isn't exactly in the best spot to lead the party to victory. Is it possible he's in better shape that there are no challengers or perceived challengers? Or am I wrong? And are there people out there who might be preparing to launch themselves onto the national stage in some way?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that one of the advantages he has had as the Conservative leader, after a very difficult loss, after the Liberals win a fourth consecutive government, in many cases historically, that would mean for either party, that would mean the leader who lost is out. And if the Conservatives had a figure waiting in the wings like Paul Martin was for so long when Jean Chrétien was in power, it's not too much of a stretch to think that Poilievre wouldn't be the leader anymore of the Conservative Party. Mm-hmm. So it will be interesting if someone emerges. Someone to this point has not, at least to the best of my knowledge, in terms of someone who's going to galvanize the support of Conservatives who think it's time to move on from Poilievre. But we've just seen in recent hours, in fact, as you know, that Ontario Cabinet Minister Caroline Mulroney has announced that she's stepping away from both cabinet and from the legislature. And her name, and her brother's, by the way, have been among those names mentioned as possible successors to Mr. Poilievre. And I have no idea what is in the mind of Ms. Mulroney, or I don't know what her motivations are. But I would say if she were planning to become prime minister and she wanted to be the next Conservative leader to take Mr. Poilievre's job, then this would be a good step to take. So we'll see in the coming months, perhaps years, what sort of steps she takes, if we see her on the road a lot, things like that, then I think it's fair to say she's trying to set herself up as someone who's waiting in the wings. But perhaps too soon to tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, it's never a dull moment in Canadian politics in general these days, especially in conservative politics. We will see how things play out for Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives over the coming months. Simon, thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Simon Tuck. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.